Hello everyone, and welcome to today's tutorial. Today I'll be completing the Simplicity pattern 8444. This project today was requested by you guys since you liked my tutorial where I made the blouse for this pattern. So I'm excited to have finally put the rest of this pattern together. It is by far the most exciting pattern I have done yet. This pattern has a lot of pieces and a lot of steps, but it wasn't as difficult to put together as it looks. Going through my stash of hoarded fabrics, this was the most perfect fabric I had for this project. As much as I wanted to do a border print fabric, I promised myself I would use my stash first. But I'm really happy I went with this fabric in the end. I did pick and choose what kind of trims I wanted to use, so I didn't exactly go with what the pattern required as far as exact sizes and which ones I was using. But that's half the fun of creating, is that you can make it how you want. But I did use most. I am so sorry this is going to be a long video, but since there's so many steps and so much going on with this pattern, I tried my best not to cut everything out, to be as detailed as I possibly could. I will be combining the top from view A with the bottom of view B. This pattern requires a lot of pieces, so I will be using number 8, number 9, number 10, number 11, number 12 to 16, number 17, number 18, and number 24. I will be making mine in a size 18. So the first thing we're going to do is of course cut out all of our pieces, and I'm starting with the main body skirt. Since I do have a repeating pattern, I had to modify what I was cutting out for the skirt. So I left a guide here to reference how I got my measurements, and in case you are using the smaller size pattern packet, I'm not sure if it's the same size piece, so hopefully this gives you an idea on how to figure out the measurements for yours. So you should have 3 pieces for your skirt. Otherwise, if you're using a border print fabric, just follow the pattern piece and fold it in half and cut out 1. This pattern has a ton of pieces to it, so I figure marking it clearly in the video would help a little more than me describing each piece. Just a side note, I accidentally cut out the number 8 in my main cotton fabric. You don't have to do that. You just need to cut 2 from your contrast fabric, which also doubles as your lining. For the pattern pieces 12 to 16, you're going to measure it along each guide and cut to that size. And then to make it easier for myself, I just added a small number on the end of each one to know which was which. Number 18 is also a guide for your 3.5 wide lace. You're going to lay the decorative end of your lace along the straight line of your pattern piece. Just kind of straighten it as best as you can, and then you're going to cut each end with the curve of your pattern. And you'll do that to 2 pieces. Once everything is cut out, just go back and mark all your dots and your notches. If you're using a repeating pattern, when you get to your skirt body pieces, you're going to lay out 2 of them with wrong sides together. And we're going to line that up against our pattern piece so we can mark those dots on the pattern. And these will eventually become your front pieces. And then slide your pattern piece over, and you're going to take that last skirt piece, and keeping it folded in half, you're going to line it up with that center fold line. And here you can mark the notch. This will become your back skirt piece. Taking one piece of our number 8 and our 3/8 inch wide satin ribbon, we're going to cut out 10 pieces that are 6.5 inches long. Start with one piece of ribbon going from the top dot to the second dot. On the top dot, you want to make sure the ribbon is right underneath that dot, and then the other side will go directly on top of the dot. Go ahead and do this on the other side. And then you're going to continue crossing your pieces down, laying each end on top of each dot. When you get to those last 2, we're going to lay that last end of our ribbon above the last dot, and same thing on the other side. You're going to base stitch this on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and trim off any excess ribbon. I'm going to grab my 1 1/8 inch lace, and I want the raw edge of my lace to be just past that 5/8 inch base stitch that we made. That way when you sew it on, you shouldn't see any of the raw edge. Add the lace to the other side as well. Then we're going to sew this on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim off any excess lace on the ends. Next, we're moving on to our number 9 pieces, and we're going to iron on the interfacing to the back of each piece. Taking our number 8, with your nice sides together, you're going to line up each piece with the edge. It's important that you make sure the print of your fabric is going the right direction. We're going to sew these on with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So you should have something like this. From here, we're going to iron our seams toward the center, but you want to make sure that the lace is facing away from the center at the same time. And do the same to the other side. Once again, we're going to grab that lace that we used before, and just like the last time, you want to make sure that the raw edge is inside of 5/8 inches. Your lace should also be facing toward the center. Sew this lace on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then you can go ahead and cut off that excess lace. Taking our two number 10 pieces, you're going to iron on the inner facing on the back of each piece. Taking the bodice piece that we've been working on, you want to lay the curved edge of the number 10 with that straight edge, with nice sides facing together. As you pin this, you want to kind of maneuver the fabric around that curve so it lines up with that straight edge. We're going to sew these on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Keep in mind, as you sew down that curved edge, you just want to try and keep the fabric where you're sewing flat, and at the same time keeping it lined up with that straight edge. So just go slow and sew little bits at a time. So this is what we have so far. And once again here, we're going to iron down our seams toward the center, making sure that that lace is facing away from the center. Doing that on both sides. The fabric will pucker a little where that curve is, so make sure when you iron down that you're not ironing down any folds. Go ahead and grab your baby rickrack trim, and we're going to line this up with the center of the 4 seams that we've made. And we're going to sew these on right down the middle. Grabbing more of that 3.5 inch wide lace, to get the length that we need, you're going to line it up with the top of the bodice and fold it back over. We're going to base stitch the top of this lace with the 1/16 inch seam allowance. Before starting, you want to make sure you have a 3 to 4 inch tail of thread. Make sure to leave another 3 to 4 inch tail of thread at the end. Grabbing the top thread, you're going to gently pull to gather the lace. And we're just going to gather this enough to line up perfectly with the top edge of the bodice. Once you have the size you want, you can tie off the ends and then go back and distribute the gathers evenly. Once you pin this down, you also want to pin down the sides of the lace as well. So we're going to sew on the lace with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, as well as sewing the lace down on each side. Taking our number 18 lace pieces, we're going to base stitch along the top of each one. Starting with that tail of thread, we're going to do a 1/16 inch seam allowance with the tail of thread at the end, and then do the same thing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Do this to both pieces. Next, taking our number 17 shoulder straps, you're going to take two, making sure they're opposite to each other, and we're going to iron on the interfacing to the back of each piece. Take one of the lace pieces, lining the straight edge up with the long side of the strap. And grabbing the two top threads, you're going to gently pull to gather the lace. And you're going to gather this to match those two small dots. Once you have the side, you can tie off the ends a little bit and distribute the gathers evenly. Do the same to the other strap, and then you can pin this on. Sew the lace on with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once the lace is sewed on, we're going to roll it up and pin that extra lace to the center of the strap. We're basically doing this so that when we sew on the next piece, our lace won't get caught in any of the seam allowances. So do your best to just tuck it up so that it's in the middle and out of the way. Make sure the pins face the straight edge. I didn't do this, but it will be important later on when I'm turning them inside out. You're going to take the other two strap pieces and lay them on top, matching each side, and nice sides facing together. Go ahead and pin this together. We're going to sew a 3/8 inch seam allowance down the side, across the straight edge, and up the other side. Take your scissors and snip off the corners, and this will help the corners turn out nicely. Then we can turn these both inside out. Be very careful with the pins The best way that I did this was I started turning out that open end, then I just reached for the lace further inside and pulled it out. But just be very careful of the pins. Once your straps are turned out, we can iron these down so they lay nicely. Going back to our bodice piece, you want to line up the small dots on the top. Make sure that your lace is facing outward. Sew both your straps on with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to start working on the lining of our bodice. So your number 8 is going to go face up in the middle, and then the number 9 will line up with each edge with nice sides facing together. Then open that up, and taking your number 10, you want the curved edge to line up with that straight edge, with the curve being on top and nice sides facing together. So it should look identical to the other bodice piece. And we're going to sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Same thing, we will iron the seams toward the center. At the bottom of the bodice, we're going to fold over 5/8 inches and iron it down. Taking the front bodice, we're going to lay the lining on top with nice sides facing together. Line up the top edge and pin it together. Sew it on with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to cut off half of that seam allowance that we just sewed. Open up your bodice and your lining. Flatten out your fabrics from that top seam, making sure that the seam allowance is facing toward the lining. You're going to pin the lining and the seam allowance together. Then we're going to top stitch with a 1/16 inch seam allowance. Fold the lining to the back, and we want to make that top edge nice and neat, making sure that the lace is pushed all the way to the front and the lining is pushed all the way to the back. Then we can iron this down so everything looks neat and stays in place. Next up is the number 11, and we're folding this in half lengthwise. We're going to sew the bottom together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to start by marking the lines that were indicated on our pattern. So you should have 3 in the middle. You're going to add a 3/8 inch seam to the top where the fold is. Once those are marked, you're also going to add another line 3/8 inches above the bottom 4. This is what's going to create our channels for the elastic. Go ahead and sew along each line, making 9 in total. So now that we have our channel sewn in, we're going to grab our 5 pieces of elastic and you're going to grab some safety pins. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a safety pin to one end of each elastic. So you're going to start with your number 12 elastic, or the longest one, and that's going to go in the first channel that we made. You're going to slide in the safety pin first, and the safety pin is what's going to help you push the elastic through. So you just kind of push it in and then it'll bunch up the fabric a little bit and then you can pull it through. So you're just going to start maneuvering the elastic through the channel, and then once that end gets close to the opening, you want to safety pin that end down. That way it doesn't get lost inside. And once you get to that other end of the channel, you're going to safety pin that end down as well. And then just continue this for the next 4 channels, making sure to go in order from the 12th elastic down to the 16th elastic. So it should go from the biggest to the smallest. To make this easier for myself, I decided to sew down the elastic to each channel first before I moved on to the next step. So I just made sure that the elastic poked out of that hole maybe about 1/4 of an inch or so, and I just sewed across with a 3/8 inch seam allowance back and forth a couple times just to make sure it was secured in that spot. But it does definitely help in the next step. So we're going to pick up our front bodice again, and this time we're going to open it up. And then we're going to grab the back bodice piece, and making sure right sides are together with that front bodice piece, you're going to line up the edges on each side and pin them together. We're going to sew the sides down with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So this next part is a little bit tricky. We're going to start by pulling the straps through the middle of our bodice. And then you're going to fold over the lining over the top of the back of the bodice. So what you'll be able to see is the back of the lining and the back of your front bodice piece. And you want to line up the edges nice and neat. We're going to sew down the sides again with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, but you want to stop 3 inches above the bottom. Once that's sewn, we're going to re-flip the lining back out. So when you turn everything out completely, your bodice should look nearly complete. Putting that aside for now, we're going to work on our skirt. If you're using a repeating pattern like I am, at this point you're going to pick up your 3 pieces. Start by laying one of your front skirt pieces face up, and then you're going to lay the back skirt piece on top with nice sides facing together. Go ahead and pin one of those sides together. And then opening that up so the back piece is faced up, you're gonna lay the second front piece on top of that. Match up that open end and pin that together as well. We're gonna sew those seams together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I went back and I serged or zigzag stitch over that open edge to prevent fraying. Starting at the bottom edge of that skirt, we're going to fold it over 3/8 inches and iron it down all the way across. We're going to sew this down with a 1/16 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to go back and fold over another 3/8 inches and iron that down as well. Then opening that fold back up, we're going to add the lace to the bottom of our skirt. So you want the lace to face towards your fabric, and we want to sew the lace on at a 1/16 inch seam allowance, making sure that that raw edge of your lace is inside that seam allowance. Once all the lace is sewn on, we're going to go back and remake that fold. Then we're going to sew that fold down with a 3/8 inch seam allowance or just before the edge of that fold. This next part is optional, but I thought it helped tie in the skirt a little more with the bodice. So I added some more of that baby rickrack trim, and I'm just sewing it on in a straight line right on top of that seam allowance that we just sewed. Taking those open ends of your skirt, you're going to serge or zigzag stitch the edges to keep these from fraying as well. We're going to fold over the edge 3/8 inches and iron it down. And then I just sewed this down just before that serged or zigzagged edge, depending on what you're using. Going to the top edge of our skirt, we're going to make a base stitch. Starting with a 3 or 4 inch tail of thread, we're going to do a 1/16 inch seam allowance base stitch. Make sure to leave a 3 or 4 inch tail of thread at the end as well. Then we're going to do the same thing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So we're going to start gathering our skirt. We're going to grab the top 2 threads, and you're just going to start gently pulling while holding on to the fabric gently, and your skirt will start to gather. This is what we have been doing with the other things we have gathered so far, so hopefully you can see it a little more clearly here. So just start gathering up your skirt, and you can gather from the other side as well, making sure to grab those top 2 threads. So the best way to do this next part is I took my back bodice pattern piece and I measured how long it was for the length. So you're going to go ahead and find the 2 small dots on your skirt, and you want those 2 dots to be gathered enough to match the length of your pattern piece. So there should be some gathers in the middle there, but there won't be much. Once you have that length that you need, you can go back and distribute those gathers that are in the middle nice and evenly. Then you're going to match the small dots on your skirt with the small dots on your bodice. Then, taking the front section of the skirt, you're going to gather it as much as you can from where you pinned the small dot to the first seam on the bodice that we made. Go ahead and pin down the end to the bodice, and then you can distribute your gathers in between that nice and even as well. Then go ahead and do this on the other side. When we sew on the back of the skirt to the back of the bodice, you're going to line up the edges and sew along that 5/8 inch seam, and then you want to stretch out the back bodice piece as you're sewing. So we're going to sew this all the way around. So when I get to my sewing machine, you're going to sew the first section like you normally would to sew them together. And then once you get to that back section, you're going to stretch out the elastic so the fabric of the bodice is flat, and then just lay the skirt layer right over top, and then go ahead and sew that together. So you will have to work in little sections doing this. But if you measured correctly, once you get to the other end, all that extra fabric on the back of your skirt piece should match up perfectly with the back of your bodice. And then once you get to that other dot, you can continue sewing the rest of the skirt on like normal. Now that it's sewed on, you can see that when I stretch out the bodice, the skirt will stretch with it. I'm going to take my iron and iron down the 5/8 inches of that front contrasting fabric, and also the 3 inches of the sides of our lining on both sides. I want to keep things nice and neat, so I'm going to serge or zigzag stitch the top edge of the seam allowance. Because some of this won't be tucked in the lining, so I want it to look nice and neat. Stretch the back bodice while you serge, just like you did before. Then you're just going to iron the seam allowance toward the middle, except the back bodice section. Taking the lining, we're going to fold it over nicely over all of our seam allowances and pin it down. Moving on to finishing up the straps. You're going to match the small dot on the back of your bodice with the small dot on the strap. This end is adjustable, so you can try on the dress and adjust the straps accordingly. That's why the strap has so much extra fabric on the bottom in case you need to add more for a better fit. Go ahead and pin down the other strap as well. We're going to sew both of these on at a 3/8 inch seam allowance and make sure not to sew over the elastic. And our last step to finishing this dress is we're going to do a ladder or slip stitch all the way across that opening on the lining and then that little open gap at the straps. So you want to stitch it to the top of that bodice edge. If you do not know how to do a slip stitch or ladder stitch, I will leave a video link down below for you. Grab that large wide satin ribbon so you can go ahead and put together a few large bows, and you can add them to the shoulder straps and the front middle of the bodice as well. You can do this by sewing it on by hand. I ended up just making a bow in the front and attaching it with a safety pin, and that way you can always remove them if you feel like it. This pattern was so fun to make, and if you're looking to try and make your own Lolita clothes, this would be a perfect way to get some really great pieces in your wardrobe. I hope that this helped those of you that were intimidated by trying out this pattern. Like I said, there is a lot of steps and a lot of pieces, but it does have a very basic structure. I do have a video tutorial already making the blouse for this pattern, so I'll leave that linked to this video as well as down below. And the petticoat I'm using in this video is also one of my previous videos that I will also leave linked down below for you as well. Stay tuned, I do have the underskirt tutorial coming soon. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!